The truth is that the richest man in the city once spent an entire night lying on a cold sidewalk just to see if kindness still existed. On a bitter winter evening in the heart of Chicago, the wind swept through the streets like a blade slicing between towering glass buildings and long rows of tired storefronts. People hurried along the sidewalks with their coats pulled tight and their heads lowered against the freezing air. Traffic lights flickered red and green across wet pavement, while the distant wail of a siren echoed somewhere far away. Near the corner of West Madison Street, a man sat slumped against the brick wall of a closed pharmacy. His coat was thin and worn. His hair was unkempt. A small cardboard sign rested beside him, though the wind had nearly blown it away. Dozens of people passed by him that night. Some glanced briefly before looking away. Others walked faster as if poverty might somehow be contagious. A group of office workers stepped around him without saying a word. A young couple crossed to the other side of the street. No one stopped. No one asked if he was all right. Then a woman appeared through the blowing snow. Her name was Hannah Miller, and she had just finished a long shift at a neighborhood diner 2 blocks away. Her feet ached from standing all day, and the thin soles of her shoes were no match for the freezing sidewalk. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and quickened her pace toward the bus stop. But as she passed the corner, she noticed the man against the wall. For a moment, she hesitated. Everyone else had ignored him. It would have been easy to keep walking. Instead, Hannah slowed down. The man lifted his head slightly. His eyes looked tired but strangely calm, as if he had been studying the world all evening. Hannah stepped closer and spoke, gently asking if he needed help or something warm to eat. Before we continue the story, take a moment to comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Hannah reached into her small canvas bag and pulled out the container that held the last bowl of chicken soup from the diner kitchen. She had planned to eat it when she finally got home. Without another thought, she knelt beside the stranger and placed the warm container into his cold hands. Steam rose into the freezing air between them. The man stared at the soup in quiet surprise. Most people had treated him like he was invisible, but this young woman had stopped without hesitation. Hannah gave a small, tired smile and told him that everyone deserved a warm meal on a night like this. As he looked up at her, the streetlight revealed something unusual about the stranger. Despite the worn coat and rough appearance, his eyes held a sharp awareness that did not match the role he seemed to be playing. Hannah did not notice the expensive watch hidden beneath the sleeve of his coat. She did not notice the black car parked half a block away with its engine quietly running. She only saw someone who needed help. And as the snow continued to fall across the quiet Chicago street, neither of them knew that this small moment of kindness was about to change both of their lives forever. The man held the warm container of soup for several seconds before speaking again. Steam curled slowly into the frozen air, while the sound of distant traffic hummed through the streets of Chicago. Hannah remained crouched beside him, rubbing her hands together to keep them warm. The wind tugged lightly at her coat and blew strands of hair across her face. The stranger finally lifted the lid and stared at the simple meal as if it were something rare and valuable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly that he could not remember the last time someone had stopped for him without expecting something in return. Hannah shrugged gently and told him that kindness should not come with conditions. She explained that she worked at a small diner nearby, and that leftover soup was better shared than thrown away. The man studied her face with a thoughtful expression that seemed strangely intense for someone sitting on a freezing sidewalk. He asked her name. She answered that her name was Hannah Miller. When she asked for his name, he paused before answering. After a moment, he simply said that his name was Alex. He did not offer anything more. Hannah nodded as if that was enough. She did not press him with questions. Around them, the city continued moving without noticing the quiet moment unfolding at the edge of the street. A city bus roared past, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and melting snow. The glow of a streetlight above them cast long shadows across the pavement. Alex slowly began eating the soup. Each spoonful seemed to bring warmth back into his hands and color back into his face. Hannah watched for a second and then stood up. She told him that the bus would arrive soon and she needed to get home before the temperature dropped even lower. Alex thanked her again, but his voice carried something deeper than simple gratitude. It sounded like surprise. As Hannah turned to leave, he suddenly asked her why she had stopped when everyone else had walked past him. Hannah looked back over her shoulder and thought about the question for a moment before answering in the simplest way she knew how. She said that when she was younger, her mother always told her that the world becomes colder every time someone ignores a person in need. Then she smiled softly and added that she was only trying to keep the world a little warmer tonight. Alex watched her walk toward the bus stop while the snow continued falling around the quiet street. For a brief moment, something unreadable crossed his face. Hidden beneath the sleeve of his worn coat, his hand tightened slightly around a watch worth more than most people in the neighborhood earned in a year. Down the street, a dark luxury car remained parked beside the curb. The driver inside the vehicle had been watching the entire interaction through the windshield without stepping out. Alex finished the last spoonful of soup and slowly closed the lid of the container. The warmth of the meal lingered in his chest, but the warmth of the moment stayed even longer in his thoughts. He looked once more toward the bus stop, where Hannah now stood alone beneath a flickering light, waiting for the late evening bus. Most people would forget a stranger by morning, but Alex knew something different had happened tonight. The simple kindness of a tired diner worker had interrupted a test that had been planned for weeks. And for the first time since the test had begun, he was no longer certain that he was the one observing the world. Instead, he felt as if the world had just revealed something important to him. When the bus finally arrived, Hannah stepped aboard and disappeared behind the closing doors. Alex remained seated on the cold sidewalk for several minutes longer, watching the empty street. Then he stood up slowly and brushed the snow from his coat. The luxury car at the corner started its engine at the same moment. Within seconds, Alex was walking toward it, no longer looking like a helpless stranger, but like someone returning to a role that had only been temporarily set aside. As the car door opened, the driver spoke, quietly asking if the evening had provided the answer he was looking for. Alex glanced once more toward the direction of the departing bus and said that it had given him something far more valuable than an answer. It had given him a name, Hannah Miller. The next morning, the city of Chicago woke under a pale gray sky that still carried the quiet aftertaste of the storm. Snow clung to sidewalks and gathered along the edges of parked cars while early commuters shuffled through the cold with coffee cups in their hands. Hannah Miller stepped off the city bus 2 blocks from the diner where she worked and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. The warmth from the bus had faded quickly, and the sharp winter air bit at her cheeks as she walked toward the familiar red sign glowing above the corner restaurant. Inside the diner, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. The room buzzed with the sounds of plates clinking and customers talking over breakfast. Hannah tied her apron behind her back and moved quickly between tables, taking orders and pouring coffee. Her shift had only been underway for a few minutes when her coworker Maria leaned over the counter and asked if she had stayed warm during the storm the night before. Hannah smiled and said that she had managed. She did not mention the man she had met on the sidewalk or the bowl of soup she had given away. To Hannah, the moment had felt small and simple. It was just something she had done because it felt right. As the morning rush continued, she refilled mugs and delivered plates while the manager called out orders from behind the kitchen window. Outside, the diner traffic crawled slowly along streets, still wet from melting snow. Hannah moved through the busy room with quiet determination, the way she always did when life felt heavy, but she refused to complain. A few hours later, the rush slowed, and she finally had a moment to breathe near the counter. She poured herself a small cup of coffee and stared through the window at the street beyond the glass. For a brief moment, she thought about the stranger she had met the night before. She wondered if he had found somewhere warm to sleep or if he was still out there in the cold. The thought lingered for only a few seconds before another customer waved for her attention and she hurried back to work. Across the city, far from the small diner, another morning had begun very differently. High above the streets, inside, a towering building of steel and glass, a large office overlooked the frozen skyline. The view stretched across miles of buildings and frozen lake water glowing beneath the winter sun. Standing near the tall window, Alex removed the worn coat he had used the night before and placed it carefully across the back of a chair. Beneath it, he now wore a dark tailored suit that fit perfectly across his shoulders. The expensive watch hidden beneath the sleeve of the coat the night before was now clearly visible on his wrist. A man in a gray suit stepped into the office holding a digital tablet. He addressed Alex with quiet respect and asked if the evening observation had been successful. Alex did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out across the city for several seconds, as if searching the streets far below for something that could not possibly be seen from that height. Finally, he spoke and said that the test had been successful in a way that none of them expected. The man with the tablet nodded and asked if the results should be added to the report for the Foundation project. Alex turned away from the window and said that the report could wait. What mattered was the name he had learned. He repeated the name slowly, as if committing it to memory. Hannah Miller. The assistant wrote the name down carefully and asked if she should begin a background search. Alex paused again before answering. His voice carried a thoughtful tone that suggested the decision meant more than a simple business instruction. He said that the search should remain quiet and respectful because Hannah Miller was not a subject in a report. She was someone who had changed the direction of the entire project with a single act of kindness. The assistant nodded and left the office, leaving Alex alone with the wide, silent view of the city. Far below, people hurried along sidewalks without knowing that somewhere among them was a young woman who had unknowingly become the center of attention in a world far more powerful than the one she lived in. Back at the diner, Hannah wiped down a table and laughed with Maria about a customer who had tried to order pancakes without syrup. The moment felt ordinary and peaceful. Yet somewhere beyond the simple walls of that small restaurant, events had already begun moving quietly in her direction. And Hannah Miller had no idea that the stranger she had helped the night before was now preparing to step back in her life in a way that would change everything. Later that afternoon, the gray winter light began to fade behind the buildings of Chicago as the diner slowly emptied after the lunch crowd. Hannah Miller wiped the last table near the window and stacked a set of clean coffee mugs behind the counter. Her feet ached the way they always did after a long shift, but she welcomed the quiet moment. Maria leaned against the counter beside her and joked that the storm the night before must have scared away half the regular customers. Hannah laughed softly and said that the city always moved slower after heavy snow. Outside the window, people walked carefully across sidewalks, still covered with patches of ice, while the sound of passing cars echoed along the narrow street. Hannah finished tying the garbage bags near the kitchen door when the diner manager stepped out from the back office holding a clipboard. His expression carried the same tight look it always did when something was wrong. He cleared his throat and called Hannah over. She walked toward him with a confused smile, thinking he might ask her to cover an extra shift later in the week. Instead, he told her that business had been slow and the owner wanted to cut hours for several workers. Hannah listened quietly as he explained that her schedule would be reduced starting next week. The words felt like cold water suddenly poured over her shoulders. She asked how many hours she would lose, and the manager answered that she would probably only work 2 days each week for a while. Hannah forced a calm expression, even though she could already feel the worry forming in her chest. 2 days of work would not cover her rent. She thanked the manager politely and walked back to the counter where Maria waited with a concerned look. Maria asked what had happened, and Hannah explained the situation with a tired shrug. She tried to sound optimistic, but Maria could hear the strain in her voice. The two women stood silently for a moment before Maria gently reminded Hannah that things always had a way of working out even when life felt unfair. Hannah nodded and gathered her coat from the hook near the kitchen door. The evening sky outside had turned a deep shade of blue, and the air looked even colder than the night before. She stepped out of the diner and pulled her scarf around her neck as she started the long walk toward the bus stop. The wind pushed through the street, carrying the smell of snow and distant traffic. As she walked, she thought about the rent due at the end of the month and the growing stack of bills waiting on the small table in her apartment. The future suddenly felt uncertain in a way that made the quiet street seem even colder. A few minutes later, she reached the corner where she had met Alex the night before. The spot beside the pharmacy wall was empty now. Only a thin line of snow remained along the edge of the sidewalk where he had been sitting. Hannah paused for a moment and looked at the ground where the cardboard sign had rested. She wondered briefly where he might be tonight. Maybe he had found shelter somewhere warmer, or maybe he had moved on to another part of the city where people might be kinder. The thought made her smile, faintly even as the wind tugged at her coat. She did not realize that less than a mile away a dark luxury car had already entered the neighborhood, moving slowly through the evening traffic. Inside the back seat, Alex sat quietly watching the city pass beyond the window. The worn coat from a night before rested folded beside him while the soft glow of streetlights reflected across the polished glass. His assistant sat in the front seat reviewing information on a tablet before turning slightly to speak. She explained that the background information they had gathered about Hannah Miller showed a simple life filled with long work hours and very little financial security. Alex listened without interrupting while the car rolled past rows of small apartment buildings and corner shops. When the assistant finished her report, she asked if he wanted to proceed with the next step of the foundation project. Alex looked out the window again as the car turned onto the very street where Hannah now waited for the bus. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he answered quietly that the next step would not follow the original plan. The driver slowed the car as they approached the bus stop ahead. Under the dim light, Hannah Miller stood alone, brushing snow from her sleeve and watching the empty street for the arrival of the next bus. She had no idea that the stranger she had helped the night before was only a few yards away, preparing to step back into her world. The wind continued to sweep through the quiet Chicago street as Hannah Miller stood beneath the dim bus stop light, watching the empty road. Snow shifted softly across the sidewalk, and the distant sound of traffic echoed between rows of brick buildings. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and checked the bus schedule posted on the metal pole. The next bus would arrive in several minutes. For now, the street felt strangely still. Behind her, a pair of headlights slowed as a dark luxury car rolled quietly toward the curb. Hannah barely noticed the vehicle at first. Cars often passed through the neighborhood on their way to the main avenue 2 blocks away. But this car slowed more than usual before stopping a short distance from the bus stop. Inside the vehicle, Alex watched her through the window with calm focus. The assistant in the front seat lowered the tablet she had been holding and spoke softly, asking if he was certain about approaching her again so soon. Alex answered that sometimes the most honest moments in life happened without preparation. The driver glanced through the rear view mirror, waiting for instruction. After a brief pause, Alex told him to remain parked for the moment. Outside, the cold air carried the faint rumble of another approaching car somewhere down the street. Hannah shifted her weight from one foot to the other and rubbed her hands together, trying to keep warm. The day had already been difficult, and the news about her reduced work hours weighed heavily on her mind. She thought about the rent that would soon be due and the growing uncertainty about how she would manage the coming weeks. The bus still had not arrived. As she waited, she glanced again toward the corner where she had met Alex the night before. The spot beside the pharmacy wall looked empty and ordinary now, as if the small moment they had shared had never happened at all. Hannah let out a quiet breath and told herself that life was simply full of brief encounters that came and went without leaving much behind. Just then the door of the dark car opened and a tall figure stepped out onto the sidewalk. Hannah turned slightly when she heard the door close behind him. For a moment she did not recognize the man walking toward the bus stop. The worn coat and rough appearance from the night before were gone. Instead, the man approaching her wore a dark overcoat that fit neatly across his shoulders and polished shoes that reflected the streetlight above them. It took several seconds before Hannah realized who it was. Her eyes widened with surprise. Alex stopped a few steps away and gave her a small, respectful nod. The quiet smile on his face carried the same calm expression she remembered from the night before. Hannah looked from him to the car behind him and then back again as confusion crossed her face. She asked softly if he was the same person she had spoken to beside the pharmacy wall. Alex answered that he was indeed the same person, though tonight he appeared slightly different. Hannah let out a short breath of disbelief and said that slightly different might be the greatest understatement she had ever heard. The contrast between the man she had met the night before and the one standing in front of her now felt almost impossible to explain. Alex glanced briefly toward the waiting car before returning his attention to Hannah. He told her that the soup she had given him had been the warmest meal he had experienced in a long time. Hannah shook her head gently and said that if she had known he owned a car like that, she might have charged him for the soup. Alex laughed quietly at the remark and replied that the car belonged to his company, not to him personally. Hannah studied him for a moment, trying to decide whether he was joking. The distant rumble of the approaching bus finally echoed down the street as its headlights appeared around the corner. Hannah looked toward the bus and then back at Alex, unsure why he had come back to find her. Alex noticed the uncertainty in her expression and spoke calmly before the bus arrived. He said that sometimes a single act of kindness deserved more than a simple thank you. As the bus slowed toward the stop, Hannah sensed that the stranger she had helped the night before was about to reveal something far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The bus slowed as it approached the stop, and the soft hiss of its brakes filled the quiet winter street. Its headlights washed across the snow-covered pavement, and the metal doors opened with a low mechanical sigh. A few passengers inside glanced toward the sidewalk while the driver waited patiently. Hannah Miller looked from the bus to Alex and back again. Normally, she would have stepped forward immediately because missing the bus meant waiting another long stretch in the cold. But something in Alex's voice had stopped her. The way he had spoken made it clear that he had not returned simply to say thank you. Hannah hesitated for several seconds while the cold wind moved gently through the street. Finally, she stepped back from the curb, allowing the bus driver to close the doors and continue down the road. The bus pulled away, leaving behind a fading cloud of exhaust and the quiet hum of the empty street. Hannah folded her arms and looked directly at Alex. She told him that now he had her full attention and asked what exactly he meant by saying that kindness deserved more than a simple thank you. Alex studied her expression carefully. The streetlight above them reflected softly across the snow, and the distant city sound seemed to fade as the moment stretched between them. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a simple black business card. Without speaking, he handed the card to Hannah. She looked down at it with mild curiosity. The white lettering across the card read Alexander Whitmore, founder and Chief Executive Officer, Whitmore Foundation and Whitmore Holdings, Chicago, Illinois. Hannah stared at the card for several seconds, as if the words did not quite make sense. Then she looked up at Alex again, searching his face for some sign that he was joking. The calm expression she saw there did not change. Hannah let out a small breath of disbelief and said that if this was some kind of elaborate prank, it was a strange way to spend a winter evening. Alex gently shook his head and said that it was not a prank. He explained that the night before had been part of a personal project connected to the charitable foundation he had created several years earlier. The foundation worked with organizations across the country to support housing programs, community shelters, and employment opportunities for people who had fallen into poverty. But Alex believed that statistics and reports alone could never show the full truth about how people treated those who had nothing. From time to time, he chose to spend a night on the streets without revealing his identity, simply to observe how strangers responded to someone in need. Hannah listened quietly while the cold wind brushed against her coat. Alex continued explaining that the previous evening dozens of people had passed him without saying a word. Some had avoided eye contact completely. Others had walked around him as if he were not even there. But Hannah had stopped without hesitation. She had spoken to him like he was an ordinary person and offered the only warm meal she had with no expectation of anything in return. Hannah looked down again at the business card in her hand and then back toward the car parked near the corner. The pieces of the story slowly began to fit together, though the situation still felt unreal. She asked Alex why someone who clearly owned companies and foundations worth millions of dollars would choose to sit on a freezing sidewalk pretending to be homeless. Alex answered quietly that when you spend too many years surrounded by boardrooms and reports, it becomes easy to forget how the real world feels for people who struggle every day. He said the experience reminded him of something important, that success could never replace genuine human kindness. Hannah shook her head, slowly, still processing what she had just heard. She told him that she had only offered him a bowl of soup, and that it hardly seemed like the kind of act that deserved such attention. Alex smiled softly and replied that sometimes the smallest actions revealed the most about a person's character. The wind shifted again, carrying the distant rumble of another bus approaching from far down the street. Hannah stood quietly beside the bus stop, holding the card that had just changed the meaning of the previous night. She had helped a stranger without knowing anything about him, and now the stranger stood before her as one of the most powerful men in the city. And as she looked at the card again, she sensed that this unexpected meeting was only the beginning of something far larger than either of them had planned. Hannah Miller stood quietly beneath the bus stop light, holding the business card while the cold Chicago wind moved softly through the street. The words printed across the card still felt unreal in her hands. Alexander Whitmore, founder and chief executive officer, Whitmore Foundation and Whitmore Holdings, Chicago, Illinois. The name sounded familiar, though she could not immediately place where she had heard it before. She glanced up at Alex again, studying his calm expression. The man standing in front of her looked confident and composed in a way that was completely different from the quiet stranger she had met beside the pharmacy wall the night before. For a moment, Hannah wondered if she had somehow stepped into someone else's story by accident. She asked him how many people knew that he spent nights pretending to be homeless on the streets of the city. Alex answered honestly that only a small group within his foundation knew the details. Even his corporate executives rarely understood how he gathered information for the foundation projects. Hannah looked down the street where the bus had disappeared and then back at him again. The idea that one of the most powerful businessmen in Chicago had spent the night sitting against a brick wall simply to observe human behavior still felt impossible to accept. She finally said that she still did not understand why he had come back. To find her. Alex listened carefully before responding. He explained that the purpose of the project was not only to observe how strangers behaved, but also to identify people whose compassion revealed something exceptional about their character. According to Alex, the foundation supported several programs that relied on individuals who truly understood hardship and empathy. He believed that people who had experienced struggle often had the greatest ability to help others rise above it. Hannah laughed quietly and told him that he had chosen the wrong person if he was looking for someone important. She explained that she worked long shifts at a diner and barely managed to keep up with rent and bills each month. In her opinion, she had done nothing extraordinary the night before. She had simply offered soup to someone who looked cold and hungry. Alex nodded as if he had expected that response. He told her that genuine kindness almost always appeared ordinary to the person offering it. Yet from the outside, it could reveal a strength that statistics and interviews never captured. Hannah folded the business card between her fingers as she listened. She admitted that the situation still felt uncomfortable because she did not like the idea that someone might be studying her actions without her knowledge. Alex respected her honesty and apologized if the experience made her feel like she had been part of an experiment. He explained that his intention was never to embarrass or manipulate anyone. Instead, the goal was to remind himself and his organization that real change began with small human choices. The distant rumble of another approaching bus echoed faintly along the street, though this one was still several blocks away. Hannah looked toward the direction of the sound and then back to Alex. She asked him directly whether the reason he had returned was simply to explain the project or if there was something more he wanted from her. Alex paused for a moment before answering. The glow from the streetlight reflected across the snow as he spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. He told her that during the past several years, the Whitmore Foundation had expanded its programs to include community outreach centers that worked closely with shelters and employment training groups across the city. Those centers needed people who understood the struggles faced by individuals living on the edge of poverty. Alex said he believed Hannah possessed the empathy and strength required to help lead such programs. Hannah blinked in surprise at the suggestion. She reminded him that she had no experience running programs or managing large organizations. Alex replied that experience could be learned, but compassion could not be manufactured. The foundation could train employees in policy and leadership, but it could not teach someone how to genuinely care about strangers on a freezing street. Hannah looked again at the business card resting in her hand. The idea that a simple moment of kindness might open a door into an entirely different world felt both exciting and frightening. The approaching bus lights finally appeared in the distance as the quiet winter street waited for her decision about whether to walk away from this unexpected opportunity or step into a future she had never imagined. The approaching bus headlights grew brighter as they turned the corner at the end of the street, casting long beams of white light across the frozen pavement. Hannah Miller stood beneath the metal bus stop shelter, holding the business card between her fingers while the wind brushed softly through the quiet Chicago night. The offer Alex had just made still echoed in her thoughts. He had spoken calmly, as if inviting her into an ordinary job, yet everything about the situation felt far from ordinary. Hannah looked at him again, trying to understand why someone with his wealth and influence would believe she belonged anywhere near his foundation. She finally shook her head slowly and gave a small, uncertain laugh. She told Alex that she appreciated the offer, but that he clearly did not understand her life. She explained that she had never managed anything larger than a diner table section during a busy breakfast shift. She did not have a college degree. She did not know anything about corporate offices or foundation programs. What she did know was how to carry plates, refill coffee cups, and stretch every dollar until the next paycheck arrived. Alex listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded gently as if he respected every word she had said. He answered that experience could be learned, but the ability to care about people without expecting reward was far more rare. Hannah looked away toward the approaching bus lights, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The bus slowed as it neared the stop, its engine rumbling steadily through the quiet street. She knew that stepping onto that bus would return her to the familiar routine of her small apartment and long work shifts. Accepting Alex's offer would mean stepping into something unpredictable and unfamiliar. The bus rolled to a stop beside the curb, and the doors opened with a mechanical hiss. The driver looked toward Hannah, expecting her to board. For a moment, she did not move. She glanced back at Alex and said quietly that she did not like the idea of being given an opportunity simply because she had helped someone one time. Alex responded that the opportunity was not a reward for a single act. It was an invitation to explore whether the compassion she had shown could grow into something that helped many more people. Hannah thought about his words while the bus driver waited patiently. Finally, she stepped forward toward the open doors, but paused before climbing aboard. She turned back to Alex one more time and asked him a question that had been forming in her mind since he first approached her. She asked what would happen if she accepted his offer and then failed. Alex answered without hesitation that failure was often the beginning of real understanding. He said the foundation did not expect perfection. It expected honesty and effort. Hannah studied his face carefully, trying to decide whether his calm confidence was genuine or simply another polished speech from someone used to boardrooms and negotiations. After a long moment, she stepped onto the bus. The driver closed the doors, and the vehicle began moving slowly down the street. Hannah found a seat near the window and looked back toward the bus stop. Through the glass, she could see Alex still standing beneath the streetlight, watching the bus disappear into the distance. The business card remained in her hand as the city lights passed by outside the window. Her thoughts raced between doubt and curiosity. Back at the corner, Alex remained still for several seconds after the bus had vanished from sight. His assistant stepped out from the parked car and approached him quietly. She asked whether he believed Hannah would contact him again. Alex looked down the empty street and answered that people who acted with genuine kindness often needed time before trusting opportunities they never expected. He said the important thing was that the door was now open. Several miles away, the bus carried Hannah deeper into the city while the small white letters on the business card rested against her palm. She could not yet imagine the path ahead, But the moment she slipped the card carefully into her coat pocket, she unknowingly took the first step toward a future that would challenge everything she believed about her place in the world. The bus carried Hannah Miller through the sleeping streets of Chicago, while the city lights moved slowly across the window beside her. She sat quietly near the back, holding her coat closed against the cold that still clung to her after the long evening outside. The business card from Alexander Whitmore rested inside her pocket, and even though she could no longer see, she felt its presence, as if it weighed far more than a simple piece of paper should. The rhythmic rumble of the bus engine filled the silence as passengers stared at their phones or gazed out the windows without speaking. Hannah leaned her head lightly against the glass and replayed the conversation from the bus stop again and again in her mind. Part of her wanted to believe that the entire encounter had been some strange misunderstanding. Another part of her could not ignore the calm sincerity in Alex's voice when he spoke about the foundation and the work it was trying to accomplish. After nearly 20 minutes, the bus reached the neighborhood where Hannah lived. She stepped down onto the sidewalk and began the short walk toward her small apartment building. The wind had grown colder, and the quiet streets felt almost empty except for the distant sound of a train moving somewhere across the city. Hannah climbed the narrow stairway leading to her apartment and unlocked the door. The room inside was modest and warm, with a single lamp glowing beside a worn couch. A small stack of unopened mail rested on the kitchen table, along with a notebook she used to track her monthly expenses. Hannah hung her coat on the chair and finally removed the business card from her pocket. She placed it on the table and stared at the printed name for several seconds. Alexander Whitmore, founder and chief executive officer, Whitmore Foundation and Whitmore Holdings, Chicago, Illinois. The words seemed almost absurd sitting there beside a stack of grocery receipts and utility bills. Hannah poured herself a glass of water and sat down at the table. She opened the notebook and began reviewing the numbers she had written earlier in the week. Rent would be due soon. Her work hours at the diner had been cut, and there was no guarantee the schedule would improve anytime soon. She leaned back in her chair and looked again at the card. Accepting Alex's offer could change everything about her financial situation, yet the thought of stepping into a world filled with wealthy executives and large organizations made her uneasy. She had spent most of her life learning to rely only on herself. Accepting help from someone she barely knew felt like stepping into unknown territory. The quiet ticking of the kitchen clock filled the room as Hannah sat thinking late into the night. Finally, she pushed the notebook aside and picked up the card again. She turned it over slowly, as if hoping the blank side might somehow offer an answer. The next morning arrived with pale winter sunlight shining through the apartment window. Hannah woke after only a few hours of restless sleep and prepared for another shift at the diner. Before leaving, she slipped the business card back in her coat pocket without fully understanding why she did it. Hours later, as she moved between tables carrying plates and refilling coffee cups, the thought of the foundation continued returning to her mind. During a brief break, Maria noticed Hannah staring absently at the counter and asked if something was bothering her. Hannah hesitated, but eventually told her about the stranger from the sidewalk and the unexpected offer he had made. Maria listened with wide eyes and then laughed softly in disbelief. She told Hannah that if a billionaire walked into her life offering an opportunity, she would not waste a single second thinking about it. Hannah smiled, but admitted that the situation still felt too strange to trust easily. Maria shrugged and said that sometimes life changed because of one unexpected decision. Late that afternoon, when Hannah finally stepped outside after a shift, the winter sky had turned clear and bright. She reached into her pocket and touched the edge of the business card again. This time, instead of simply putting it away, she pulled it out and looked at the number printed beneath the foundation name. Standing there, on the sidewalk, she realized that the choice in front of her was no longer about fear or uncertainty. It was about whether she was willing to believe that one small act of kindness might truly open a door she had never imagined walking through. The winter afternoon light faded slowly across Chicago as Hannah Miller stood outside the diner, holding the business card between her fingers. Cars passed along the street in a steady stream while the cold wind moved between the tall buildings and carried the faint sound of traffic from the main avenue. For several long seconds, she stared at the number printed on the card. The decision felt larger than simply making a phone call. It felt like choosing between the life she had always known and a possibility she could barely understand. Hannah took a deep breath and reached for her phone. Her hands felt slightly cold as she entered the number carefully. The line rang once, then twice. For a moment, she almost hung up, convinced that the entire situation would somehow collapse into embarrassment. But then a calm, professional voice answered the call. The woman introduced herself as the executive assistant for the Whitmore Foundation and asked how she could help. Hannah hesitated before explaining that she had met Alexander Whitmore the night before and that he had given her his card. There was a brief pause on the line before the assistant responded with immediate recognition. She said that Mr. Whitmore had been expecting Hannah's call and asked if she would be available to visit the foundation office the following morning. Hannah felt a quiet shock at how easily the conversation was unfolding. She agreed before she could fully question her own words. The assistant provided the address of the Whitmore Foundation headquarters located in a tall building near the Chicago River and then politely ended the call. Hannah lowered the phone slowly. The decision had been made before she even realized it. That night, she slept lightly, her thoughts moving between curiosity and doubt. The next morning, the city sky was bright and clear when Hannah stepped off the bus near the Chicago River. The foundation building rose high above the street with glass windows reflecting the sunlight across the water. Hannah stood for a moment looking up at the entrance, feeling suddenly out of place among the polished doors and well-dressed professionals walking through the lobby. She smoothed her coat and stepped inside. The lobby was quiet and elegant with marble floors and a reception desk near the center of the room. Hannah approached carefully and gave her name to the receptionist. Within minutes, the same assistant she had spoken to on the phone appeared from the elevator area and greeted her warmly. The woman introduced herself as Rebecca and thanked Hannah for coming. Rebecca led her through a series of hallways where large photographs on the walls showed community programs, shelters, and training centers supported by the foundation. Hannah noticed images of volunteers helping families find housing and staff members working with people who had struggled with unemployment. The scenes looked genuine and hopeful in a way that surprised her. Finally, Rebecca guided her into a large office overlooking the river. Alexander Whitmore stood near the window, speaking quietly with another staff member. When he saw Hannah enter the room, he turned and greeted her with the same calm smile she remembered from the bus stop. Hannah suddenly felt nervous again, standing in a place so different from the diner where she spent most of her days. Alex thanked the staff member and then walked toward Hannah. He told her that he was glad she had decided to visit and asked if she had found the building easily. Hannah admitted that she had nearly turned around outside the entrance because the place looked far too impressive for someone like her. Alex smiled gently and replied that impressive buildings were only useful if the people inside remembered why they existed. He invited her to sit down at a small table near the window where the city skyline stretched across the background. Hannah sat carefully while Alex explained that the foundation was preparing to open a new outreach center designed to help individuals find housing, training, and support services after experiencing homelessness. He said the center needed leaders who understood the human side of hardship rather than only policies and budgets. Hannah listened closely while the river moved quietly below the window. The opportunity he described sounded meaningful but also overwhelming. She finally asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the night they met. She asked why he believed she was capable of doing any of this. Alex answered calmly that sometimes the most powerful leaders were not the ones with the most experience, but the ones who never forgot what it felt like to stand beside someone who had nothing. Hannah looked out the window for a moment before returning her attention to Alex. The life she knew was waiting for her outside the building. Yet the path opening in front of her now offered the chance to become something she had never imagined. And for the first time, she realized that accepting this opportunity might require more courage than anything she had done before. Hannah Miller sat quietly at the small table near the window while the wide Chicago skyline stretched beyond the glass. The river below moved slowly between the tall buildings, and sunlight reflected across the water in long silver lines. Alexander Whitmore remained seated across from her with calm patience, allowing the silence to settle while she considered everything he had explained. For most of her life, Hannah had believed that the world was divided into clear and distant spaces. There were people who worked long shifts simply to pay their rent, and there were people who built foundations and corporations from high offices overlooking the city. The idea that those two worlds could suddenly cross paths still felt difficult for her to accept. After several moments, Hannah finally spoke. She said that the work Alex described sounded meaningful but also overwhelming. She told him that she had never led a team or organized programs for hundreds of people. Her experience had been limited to simple routines inside a diner where the biggest challenge was managing a busy breakfast rush. Alex listened carefully and then responded with a thoughtful smile. He explained that leadership often began long before someone held a formal position. The ability to treat people with dignity during difficult moments was a form of leadership that could not be learned in classrooms or boardrooms. He reminded Hannah that the night before she had seen a stranger who looked invisible to everyone else and had chosen to treat him as a human being rather than a problem to avoid. That choice had revealed more about her character than any resume ever could. Hannah lowered her eyes briefly, feeling both embarrassed and uncertain about the attention he was giving to such a simple moment. She admitted that she still feared disappointing him if she accepted the opportunity. Alex answered calmly. That disappointment only came when people stopped trying. The foundation expected effort and honesty, not perfection. He then explained that the outreach center would not depend on her alone. A full team of experienced coordinators and social workers would be there to support the work. Hannah Roll would focus on connecting with people who arrived at the center seeking help and guiding them toward the programs designed to rebuild their lives. The more he described the project, the more Hannah began to imagine the real impact it might have. She pictured individuals walking through the center doors after months of uncertainty and fear, hoping someone inside would listen to them without judgment. That image reminded her of the man she had seen sitting against the pharmacy wall on that freezing night. Slowly, she began to understand why Alex believed her perspective mattered. Still, she hesitated before making any promise. She told him honestly that she needed time to think because accepting the role would change everything about her daily life. Alex nodded with complete understanding. He said that decisions capable of changing a future should never be rushed. He stood and walked toward the window where the wide river curved through the center of the city. After a moment, Hannah joined him and looked out across the skyline. The city felt different from this height. Streets that had once seemed crowded and complicated now looked like quiet patterns stretching toward the horizon. Alex spoke again while they watched the sunlight move across the water. He said that the foundation work had taught him something important about the world. True change rarely began with grand speeches or enormous budgets. It usually began with one person choosing to care about another person when it would have been easier to walk away. Hannah thought about those words as the quiet office filled with afternoon light. She realized that the opportunity in front of her was not simply a job offer. It was an invitation to step into a larger purpose that might help many people who were standing in the same uncertain place she had seen the night before. After several minutes, she finally turned toward Alex again and spoke with quiet determination. She said that if she agreed to try this work, she would need to remain honest about what she did and did not know. Alex smiled and answered that honesty. It was exactly the quality that had brought her here in the first place. The moment carried a calm sense of understanding between them as the city continued moving far below the office window, unaware that a single decision made inside that quiet room was about to begin shaping a new chapter in both of their lives. Hannah Miller left the Whitmore Foundation building later that afternoon with a mind that felt both heavy and hopeful at the same time. The winter sunlight had begun to fade across the Chicago River, and the cold air outside the building felt sharper than it had earlier in the day. She walked slowly along the sidewalk with her hands in her coat pockets, while the city moved around her in its usual rhythm of traffic and footsteps. Everything looked the same as it had the day before, yet something inside her felt different. The conversation with Alexander Whitmore had opened a possibility she had never allowed herself to imagine before. For years her life had followed a predictable pattern of early mornings at the diner, long shifts on her feet, and quiet evenings inside her small apartment reviewing bills and planning the next week. Now a completely different path had appeared in front of her. The question was whether she had the courage to step onto it. That evening Hannah returned home and sat at the same kitchen table where she had studied the business card only a night earlier. The notebook filled with her monthly expenses still rested beside a stack of unopened envelopes. She opened the notebook and slowly ran her finger down the numbers she had written in careful handwriting. Rent, utilities, groceries, busfare. Every line represented the routine she had built to survive month after month. Yet tonight those familiar numbers seemed to belong to a chapter that might soon be closing. Hannah leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the cold night beside the pharmacy wall. She could still see Alex sitting quietly against a brick as the snow fell around him. At the time she had believed she was simply helping a stranger. Now she understood that moment had been the beginning of something far larger than either of them had expected. The following morning Hannah woke early before the winter sunrise had fully brightened the sky. She dressed quickly and walked toward the diner for another shift. The streets were calm, and the air carried the crisp scent of snow that had fallen lightly during the night. Inside the diner, the familiar sounds of coffee cups and breakfast orders filled the room. Maria greeted her with a cheerful smile and asked how the visit to the foundation had gone. Hannah paused for a moment before answering. She explained that Alex had offered her a chance to work with the outreach center that the Whitmore Foundation was preparing to open. Maria stared at her in disbelief and then laughed softly with excitement. She said that opportunities like that did not appear every day and reminded Hannah that sometimes life changed because someone was brave enough to say yes. Hannah continued working through the morning rush while those words echoed quietly in her thoughts. She watched the customers moving in and out of the diner and suddenly realized that the same compassion she showed to strangers every day could reach far beyond the small restaurant if she accepted the role Alex had described. Late that afternoon, Hannah finished her shift and stepped outside into the cold air again. This time, instead of walking directly toward the bus stop, she stopped on the sidewalk and took out her phone. The number saved under the name Whitmore Foundation appeared on the screen. Her heart beat a little faster as she pressed the call button. When Rebecca answered, Hannah spoke with calm determination. She said that she had thought carefully about the opportunity and that she was ready to try. Rebecca responded warmly and explained that Alex would be pleased to hear her decision. The call ended and Hannah lowered the phone slowly. The moment felt quiet but powerful. Somewhere high above the city, inside the Whitmore Foundation office, Alexander Whitmore stood beside the window looking out across the river when Rebecca entered the room. She informed him that Hannah Miller had accepted the offer to join the outreach program. Alex smiled gently and looked back toward the city skyline. In that quiet moment, he knew that the small act of kindness on a freezing sidewalk had just begun a chain of events that would change far more lives than either of them could yet imagine. The first spring sunlight of the year warmed the streets of Chicago as people gathered outside a newly renovated brick building on the west side of the city. A wide banner hung above the entrance reading Whitmore Community Outreach Center. The doors stood open and volunteers moved inside arranging chairs, preparing coffee, and welcoming visitors who had come to see the new program begin work. Only a few months had passed since Hannah Miller first walked into the Whitmore Foundation office with uncertainty in her heart, yet the changes in her life already felt extraordinary. Instead of carrying trays through a crowded diner, she now spent her days greeting people who arrived at the center, searching for help, guidance, and sometimes simply a place where someone would listen to them without judgment. The work was not easy. Some days were filled with difficult conversations and complicated situations. But every evening Hannah returned home knowing that her efforts had helped someone move one small step closer to stability. Inside the center, that morning the first orientation meeting was about to begin. Social workers spoke quietly with volunteers, while several families waited near the entrance. Hannah stood near the front desk reviewing a list of appointments when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Alexander Whitmore stepped through the doorway, wearing a simple coat instead of the formal suits he usually wore in his office. For a moment, he paused just inside the entrance, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. When Hannah noticed him, she smiled warmly and walked over to greet him. She told him that the center had already received dozens of requests for assistance during the first week of operation. Alex listened with genuine interest as she described the job training classes that had been organized and the temporary housing placements already arranged through partner organizations. The excitement in her voice made it clear that the work meant more to her than simply fulfilling a new role. Alex nodded with approval and said that the program was stronger because she had chosen to lead it with compassion. Hannah laughed softly and reminded him that she was still learning every day. Alex then reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a small object wrapped in tissue paper. He handed it to her with a thoughtful expression. Hannah opened the paper and discovered the same simple plastic container that had once held the bowl of soup she had given him on that freezing night beside the pharmacy wall. The container had been carefully cleaned and preserved. Hannah looked up in surprise while Alex explained that he had asked his assistant to retrieve it from the street after she left that evening. He said the container had become a reminder of the moment that had changed the direction of the entire foundation project. Hannah held the container gently and smiled with quiet emotion. She said she had never imagined that such a small act could lead to something so meaningful. Alex replied that real change often began with ordinary choices made by people who refused to ignore someone in need. Around them, the outreach center continued filling with visitors and volunteers ready to begin the day. Hannah placed the container carefully on the front desk, where it would remain as a simple reminder of why the center existed. As the doors opened and the first group of visitors entered the building, she greeted them with the same kindness she had shown on the cold night that started everything. Alexander Whitmore watched for a moment before stepping back toward the entrance. The city moved outside with its usual noise and motion, unaware that a single bowl of soup shared on a winter sidewalk had grown into a place where hundreds of people would find hope and support for years to come. And for Hannah Miller, the lesson was clear. Kindness offered to a stranger had not only changed one life. It had quietly begun changing an entire community.